She stood in her wedding gown, looked straight at me, and said, "You've always been a failure, Dad." In that single moment, every hidden scar of betrayal tore wide open, and I knew the truth I'd carried in silence could no longer stay buried. Before we dive into today's story, I recommend you hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new story filled with drama, resilience, and unexpected twists. If you enjoy this video, type 1 in the comments. If not, type 0 to let me know how I can make better content for you. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and maybe grab your favorite drink, because this is a tale you won't want to miss. Let's get started. My name is Franklin Mercer, but everyone calls me Frank. I am 60 years old and live alone in a weathered bungalow on the south side of Austin, Texas. The shingles curl on the roof and the porch creaks underfoot, but it is home. I drive a 2008 Ford F-150 that rattles on the freeway, its paint dulled by the Texas sun. I keep it clean though, and I keep my ledgers cleaner. Every expense I make goes into a leather-bound notebook that has softened from years of use. I log the cost of milk, the gas for the truck, even the handful of change I toss into the coin jar near the kitchen sink. That kind of habit isn't about being poor. It's about being precise, about being the man I've always been. For 3 decades, I worked as a forensic accountant, the kind of man brought into federal receiverships when fortunes collapsed or companies defrauded their clients. My work was never glamorous. I spent long nights in office basements poring over balance sheets, unraveling shell accounts, and tracing where hidden money had gone. The job demanded secrecy and patience. Numbers never lie, but they don't always speak loudly. You have to coax the truth out of them. That discipline has seeped into every corner of my life. I was married to Laura for 26 years. She had a quick laugh, even when things were hard. But life with me wasn't simple. My work took me away from home more than she could bear, and the stress of raising our daughter often fell squarely on her shoulders. We parted ways with civility, no screaming matches, no court battles. She needed distance, and I respected that. Still, when a car accident left her with lasting trauma, I quietly covered the costs of her therapy. She never asked, but she never refused either. That was the rhythm we found after divorce. Respect, distance, and a muted gratitude that passed between us like a private code. Our daughter Ava grew up bright and restless. She was always reaching for a shinier world, one that glimmered beyond the dusty suburbs of Austin. Where I saw comfort in worn boots and quiet nights, she saw limitation. Her eyes turned toward Nashville, gowns, galas, late-night parties filled with people who spoke the language of fame. She wanted that sparkle. I never begrudged her for it. Every parent wants more for their child, though it hurts sometimes to realize that in her mind, more often meant different from me. What Ava never knew was the truth I carried close to the chest. Years ago, I had been part of a whistleblower case in the healthcare sector. Fraud on a massive scale, hidden beneath layers of billing codes and false invoices. I provided the key evidence. Because the case was sealed under a court order, I was bound by a non-disclosure agreement for years. When the settlement finally cleared, my portion after taxes and careful investments grew into $18 million. I never told Ava. I kept living as I always had, eating at small diners, wearing scuffed boots, balancing my notebook each night. Money doesn't erase who you are, and in my line of work, bragging about what you've uncovered is the fastest way to ruin. So, when Ava got engaged to Colton Rivers, I showed up in my plain suit and offered my quiet congratulations. The Rivers family ran River Sound Records, an old Nashville label that still basked in memories of platinum records and sold-out tours. They liked to call themselves Old Nashville, though most of their fortune had long since dwindled. They carried themselves like nobility, though, and they looked at me as though I were a hired hand crashing the party. At the rehearsal dinner, Colton joked to his friends that he was marrying down because his bride's father still drove a pickup. His mother, Candace, gave me a practiced smile and asked if I'd managed the airfare from Austin, as though a plane ticket might break me. I smiled back, noting every word the way I would log an unbalanced account. Ava was nervous about me from the start. "Dad," she whispered one evening, "please don't wear that bolo tie. It's too Texas, she laughed, as if it were a joke, but her eyes searched mine with worry. She didn't want the rustic image. She wanted refinement. I agreed to wear a gray suit I had owned for years. I let her think she'd won that battle, though inside I wondered when my presence had become something for her to manage rather than to embrace. The wedding itself was set for Belmead Conservatory, an ornate venue on the edge of Nashville, draped with strings of golden lights and climbing bougainvillea. It was the kind of place that charged a fortune just for guests to breathe the air. I was placed at table 19, near the swinging doors where waiters carried trays of hors d'oeuvres in and out. People like me belonged in the corners, it seemed, out of the camera's view. I didn't protest. I sat quietly, folded my napkin across my lap, and watched. There is power in silence. My career taught me that the man who sits unnoticed often knows the most. I let them underestimate me. I let Ava believe I was broke, that I was an emblem of the life she wanted to escape. I had 18 million reasons not to care what they thought. But I also had one daughter, whose gaze cut deeper than any insult, and whose choices would soon drag us both into a reckoning neither of us could avoid. If you're still watching and curious about how an ordinary father's quiet life hides a storm waiting to break, comment number 1 below so I know you're with me. Now, let's keep going. The week of the wedding, my daughter texted me a short message that read more like an instruction than an invitation. "Dad, please don't wear anything too Texas." I knew exactly what she meant. She didn't want the bolo tie I had worn to every family occasion for the last 20 years. It wasn't just jewelry. It was a piece of me, a reminder of nights spent with Laura at county fairs and old photographs where Ava sat on my knee, tugging at the silver clasp. But, to her, it had become a symbol of the father she wanted to downplay. I replied with a simple, "I'll wear the gray suit." I had learned long ago that sometimes peace is cheaper than pride. When I arrived at Belmead Conservatory, the place was glowing like a stage set. Strings of lights draped over archways, tables layered with white linens, and servers in crisp uniforms gliding between clusters of guests balancing champagne flutes. I settled into the background, but the comments found their way to me anyway. At cocktail hour, I heard Colton laughing with his groomsmen. "Her dad's old school," he said, his voice carrying farther than he thought. "Blue collar through and through. Salt of the earth, I guess. At least it makes for a nice story." The group chuckled, the kind of laugh that sticks in your ribs if you let it. I didn't turn my head. Numbers had taught me patience. Every ledger closes eventually, every column must balance. Candace Rivers approached me a few minutes later, holding her glass by the stem as though it might break if she gripped it wrong. "Frank, so good of you to come," she said with a practiced warmth. "I hope the flight and hotel weren't too much trouble. It's always such an expense for families traveling in." I nodded, thanked her, and let the words pass. She wasn't asking about my comfort. She was measuring the distance between me and her idea of wealth. Ava appeared then, giving me a quick embrace. Her perfume was strong, her dress shimmering under the garden lights. She leaned close and whispered, "Dad, just don't bring up your old cases tonight. People here would rather talk about music than fraud in courtrooms." She smiled for the cameras circling nearby, but her eyes pleaded in private. I told her nothing, just gave a small nod. My silence had become the easiest answer. As the guests mingled, I took in the scene, the men in tailored suits, cufflinks flashing, the women in gowns that could have paid for a semester of tuition. They compared vacation homes in Florida, sipped champagne priced at more than my monthly groceries, and talked of investments with the casual air of people who never worried about bills. I sat with my glass of water, thinking about the checks I had written in secret years before, the tuition payments that arrived under the name of a foundation Ava never connected to me. To them, I was the man with the weathered face and worn shoes, a placeholder in the story of Ava's rise. Then the music shifted, and the master of ceremonies announced the bride's speech. Applause rippled through the hall as Ava stepped up, her gown catching the light like a spotlighted star. She began with the usual gratitude, thanking guests for being there, thanking the Rivers family for welcoming her. But her voice took a different tone when she turned toward the subject of family. "I want to thank the Rivers for showing me, for the first time, what it means to have real stability, real class," she said. "Growing up wasn't easy." My dad was kind, but always struggling. There were years when money just wasn't there. He even went through bankruptcy. I had to figure out a lot on my own, like paying for college. The guests murmured sympathetically. Some nodded with admiration for her perseverance. Others glanced at me with that particular look reserved for the unlucky. My place at table 19 seemed to shrink with every word she spoke. I set my glass down carefully, my pulse steady but slow, as though bracing for impact. I remembered the cashier's checks I had arranged each semester, the receipts filed under the scholarship fund I created in silence. I remembered the phone calls to bursars' offices, confirming payments were made on time. Ava never knew. That had been by design. But hearing her recast those years as proof of my failure cut deeper than any forensic report ever had. It wasn't the money. It was the rewriting of truth into a tale that erased every quiet sacrifice. Ava wanted the glow of triumph, the applause of overcoming, and to win it, she painted me as broke, inept, a man too small for her stage. The room clapped again, admiration flowing toward her. A few guests glanced at me with pity, a couple even with something like derision. I felt my heart slow, like a warning light on a dashboard. My instincts, sharpened by years of auditing, told me the balance sheet of this family gathering was tipping dangerously. I thought of Laura, of the nights she urged me to let Ava make her own way, to shield her but not spoil her. I had honored that, but Ava was now building a story at my expense. The old lesson echoed inside me. Silence protects only until it becomes permission. That was the moment I realized the wedding would not pass quietly for me. A line had been crossed. My daughter had begun to trade on a false version of me, and the truth I had carried for years shifted restlessly in my pocket, waiting for the day it would be revealed. If you're still watching and curious about the first cracks in their family bond, comment number 2 below so I know you're with me. Now, let's step into chapter 3. The sound of crystal glasses clinking filled the air as Ava lifted her champagne flute high. And tonight, she said with a voice that trembled just enough to seem sincere, I want to thank the man who has been like a father to me, someone who truly understands what it means to provide and to plan for the future. Hank Rivers. She turned, raising her glass toward Colton's father. The room erupted in applause. Guests stood, smiling at Hank, who puffed out his chest as if he had just been knighted. My stomach tightened. At table 19, I felt every eye shift toward me. The cousins beside me fidgeted, unsure whether to glance in sympathy or amusement. The words, like a father, hit harder than I expected. A blade twisted slowly in my chest. For 27 years, I had been her only father. I taught her to ride a bike in the cul-de-sac, bandaged scraped knees, held her through thunderstorms. And now, in front of nearly 200 people, she declared another man more worthy of the title. I stayed still, folding my napkin with deliberate care. My mind flickered back to the little girl who used to clutch my hand at school concerts, whispering that she could only sing if she knew I was in the front row. I searched for that child in the woman standing at the microphone in her designer gown, but all I saw was a stranger eager to shed me like an old coat that no longer fit her image. The word broke had already been spoken once, a dagger disguised as a memory. But this coronation of another man as her father was no slip of the tongue. It was a calculated dismissal, and the applause around me sealed it like a verdict. My pulse slowed, steadying the way it always did when I was about to walk into a deposition. I reached for my phone beneath the table. The screen lit up, battery at 60%. That would be enough. Years of habit guided me as I scrolled with quiet precision, opening folders I had built like a lawyer preparing exhibits for trial. First came the letter from the Department of Justice confirming the whistleblower case was no longer sealed. The non-disclosure agreement I had honored for years was expired, every clause now satisfied. Next, I cued the banking app, the numbers crisp and undeniable, balances that added to $18 million in accounts spread across institutions. Then the digital scans of cashier's checks, proof of tuition, semester after semester at the University of Texas, all paid from a scholarship fund I had created under another name. The evidence lay at my fingertips, a silent arsenal. I looked up at the stage. Ava basked in the glow of applause, cheeks flushed with victory. She glanced at me briefly, perhaps expecting me to sit there, diminished and embarrassed. But something inside me shifted. Silence, which had always been my shield, had now become complicity. And complicity was no longer an option. I rose slowly from my chair. The scraping of wood against tile drew attention, and the applause faded. "If I might," I said to the master of ceremonies, "I'd like a moment to offer the bride and groom a small gift." My voice was calm, steady, the tone of a man who has no doubt about his words. The MC caught off guard, gestured to the microphone. Curiosity rippled across the room like a wave. I walked to the front, every step measured, the phone in my hand glowing faintly. Ava's smile faltered. Colton leaned toward her, whispering something, but she only shook her head, eyes darting nervously. I took the microphone. "For many years," I began, "I have kept a promise of silence. I worked on matters that required me to remain discreet, even with my own family. Tonight, I'd like to honor my daughter's marriage by offering truth instead of pretense." A murmur spread through the hall. I tapped the phone screen, projecting an image onto the large monitor behind me. A scanned letter appeared, bearing the seal of the Department of Justice. Gasps echoed. "This document confirms the conclusion of a whistleblower case I participated in within the healthcare sector," I explained. "For years, I was under a non-disclosure agreement. That agreement is no longer binding." I swiped, and the next slide appeared, my bank balance. Clear, dated that very morning. The numbers glowed in bold font, over $18 million. Conversations died mid-breath, guests leaned forward, eyes wide, the Rivers family shifting uncomfortably at their table. "One might think," I continued evenly, "that my daughter paid for her own college. That is not true. Here are the checks that cleared her tuition, sent under the name of a foundation I established to shield her pride. I displayed the documents, semester after semester, tuition paid in full." The room grew so silent I could hear the hum of the air conditioning. I looked directly at Ava. Her face had gone pale, her lips pressed tightly together. She stared at the floor, refusing to meet my eyes. "The story told tonight was of a father who failed, who left his child to struggle," I said. "But facts do not bend to storytelling. Facts stand firm." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then, slowly, the applause ceased altogether. The grand hall that had moments ago cheered Ava's tale now sat stunned, trapped between disbelief and dawning recognition. I handed the microphone back to the MC and stepped aside, letting the evidence speak louder than I ever could. If you're still watching and feel the sting of betrayal growing, comment number 3 below to let me know you're following. Now let's uncover Chapter 4. The room had gone quiet after I laid out the tuition checks and the balance figures. But the silence didn't last long. Hank Rivers was the first to recover. He leaned back in his chair, pasted a smile on his face, and raised his glass in a gesture meant to reclaim the room. "Well, Frank," he said loudly, "that's impressive. But here in Nashville, we pride ourselves on class and upbringing. Talking about money at dinner is a bit gauche, don't you think?" His voice dripped with condescension, and a few scattered chuckles rose from the tables closest to him. I knew exactly what he was doing. Downplay, dismiss, reframe. It was a tactic I'd seen countless times from executives under federal investigation. The attempt to turn hard numbers into nothing more than poor taste. At another table, I heard a bridesmaid whisper just loud enough for the people around her to smirk. "He's just trying to save face." Ava seized the moment. She stood quickly, eyes bright with panic and cheeks flushed from embarrassment. "Dad," she said into the microphone, "it's okay. Really. Everyone understands. You don't have to go further." Her voice carried the urgency of someone desperate to put a lid back on a boiling pot. I gave her a small nod of acknowledgement. "I appreciate that, Ava. But no, everyone doesn't understand. Not yet." My tone was calm, but firm. I tapped my phone, and the screen behind me shifted. A new document filled the monitor. A loan agreement dated May 2020, in the earliest months of the pandemic. The letterhead of Riversound Records appeared at the top, followed by the unmistakable signatures of both Hank and Candace Rivers. I heard a sharp intake of breath from their table. During the pandemic, I explained, this company faced collapse. Concerts canceled, tours scrapped, recording sessions delayed indefinitely. Payroll was weeks from drying up. A mysterious investor stepped in to provide $2.5 million in relief. Tonight, I'd like to clarify who that investor was. The crowd murmured as eyes flicked from me to the Rivers family. Hank's smile faltered. His lawyer, seated a few rows behind, sat up straighter, his face suddenly alert. This, I continued, scrolling down, is a convertible note secured against Riversound's master recordings. The terms were simple: no interference, no demand for repayment, unless there was what the contract defined as a reputation event, an incident that endangered the credibility of the lender. In plain language, if my name or my integrity was dragged through the mud, I had the right to convert this note into controlling equity. Gasps rippled across the hall. I let the words hang, not because I wanted to threaten, but because people needed to understand the weight of what was happening. I never intended to exercise that clause, I said. I hoped Riversound would recover, and I was glad to help quietly. But tonight, when my daughter stands here and portrays me as a man who failed her, when I'm dismissed as irrelevant while my own support kept this family's business alive, it forces me to reconsider. Ava gripped the microphone, her voice cracking. Dad, stop. You're threatening my husband's family at our wedding. I looked at her evenly, letting my words land with precision. No, Ava. I'm not threatening anyone. I'm defending my dignity. There's a difference. The guests began to buzz, whispers passing from table to table. Some shook their heads, disapproving of the drama. Others leaned forward with fascination, the way people lean toward a courtroom bench when testimony gets heated. Hank had lost the smug confidence he wore earlier. His jaw tightened, and the veins in his neck stood out. He reached for his glass of wine, but his hand trembled slightly. Candace sat rigid, her lips pressed thin, staring at the contract as if she could will it to disappear. The master of ceremonies stepped forward, sweat beading on his forehead. Perhaps, he suggested carefully, we should take a short intermission after the best man's speech. Give everyone a chance to refresh their drinks. His voice tried for cheer, but it rang hollow against the rising tension. I lowered the microphone, gave the MC a polite nod, and walked slowly back toward table 19. On the way, I caught the eyes of a few older guests, businessmen, retired executives, men who knew contracts when they saw them. They gave me small, approving nods, gestures that said quietly, they understood. At the head table, Ava watched me sit down, her expression torn between fury and fear. She gripped Colton's hand so tightly his knuckles whitened. The fairy lights strung above us shimmered in the silence that followed, a fragile beauty above a storm just beginning to gather. For the first time all evening, I felt the ledger start to balance. Not finished, not even close, but balanced enough for the truth to breathe. The best man's toast had barely ended when the atmosphere in the hall began to splinter. Some guests clapped politely, eager to move past the tension, while others leaned forward, their eyes fixed on me as if waiting for the next revelation. The Rivers family sat stiff and silent at the head table. Candace's jaw was clenched so tightly, her smile looked painted on. Hank swirled the wine in his glass without drinking. Ava forced a laugh too bright to be real, her hand trembling as she brushed a strand of hair from her face. The master of ceremonies tried to regain rhythm, but the room was slipping away from him. Ava suddenly rose, snatching the microphone before the MC could speak. Her cheeks were flushed, and her voice cracked like glass. Enough, she said, her eyes locked on me. Dad, you've made your point. But you've ruined the most important day of my life. You couldn't stand sitting quietly, could you? You had to be the center of attention, even if it meant humiliating me in front of everyone I love. Her words quivered between accusation and plea. The crowd murmured, divided between sympathy and shock. Ava's tears began to spill, but they weren't the tears of heartbreak. They carried the jagged edge of fury. You hid money from me, she shouted, her voice growing louder. You lied. Made me believe we were poor just so you could teach me some twisted lesson. That's not parenting, that's betrayal. I stood, calm but steady, and took the microphone back with deliberate slowness. No, Ava, I said, my voice low but sharp enough to cut through the noise. I stayed silent so you would learn resilience, so you'd understand character matters more than comfort. I honored your mother's last wish, but tonight, you turned my silence into a weapon. You used it to tarnish me. Gasps filled the air as I pulled another device from my jacket pocket. The screen lit up, and with a few taps, the speakers crackled to life. Your mother left something behind, I said. She asked me to keep it hidden unless you ever dishonored her memory. Tonight, you crossed that line. The recording began. Laura's voice, fragile yet resolute, filled the room. Frank, if you're hearing this, I'm gone. You need to know something about Ava. She's lost her way. Last week, when I asked her to help me to the bathroom, she told me she wished she'd been born into another family. She said she was embarrassed by you, by us. It broke my heart. The words hung in the air like a funeral bell. People shifted uncomfortably. A few covered their mouths in disbelief. Ava went pale, frozen as though the oxygen had been sucked out of her lungs. The recording continued. Laura's voice trembled but grew firmer. Promise me, Frank. Don't indulge her vanity with money. Don't reward cruelty. If she ever uses my death as a way to shame you, if she ever twists our memory into a stage prop, then show her this truth. The audio ended with a faint sigh, her last recorded breath. The hall was silent. Not even the clink of glass broke it. Colton turned toward Ava, his face rigid with shock. Did you really say that? He whispered, his voice carrying farther than he intended. She stammered, but no words came out. Hank Rivers rose abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. This is outrageous, he barked. Private family matters don't belong here. This recording could be fabricated. He gestured toward me, his hand trembling. I raised the device and displayed the file properties projected on the screen. Time-stamped, unaltered, metadata intact. The truth doesn't need to shout, Hank. It just needs to be shown. Guests began whispering, chairs shifting, the tension spilling into chaos. Some looked at Ava with sympathy, but many with judgment. The bridesmaid who had whispered earlier now stared openly at her with wide, stunned eyes. A ripple of betrayal passed through the room. Ava's control finally snapped. She grabbed the microphone again, her face streaked with tears and mascara. "You've destroyed me, Dad," she screamed. "You've taken everything from me." Her voice cracked, breaking under the weight of the moment. I looked at her evenly, my voice measured. "No, Ava. You destroyed yourself. I only revealed what was already true." The room erupted. Some guests rose and left, muttering under their breath. Others pulled out phones, recording, live streaming the drama as if it were a courtroom trial. The MC threw up his hands, powerless to stop it. The fairy lights above flickered, as though the building itself felt the strain. Ava's sobs filled the space, but beneath them, the sound of whispers grew louder, whispers about her cruelty, her ambition, her mother's dying words. Her world, so carefully constructed on glitter and applause, was unraveling in front of everyone. I placed the microphone down gently, like a gavel at the end of a verdict. The fire had been lit. There was no going back. The reception hall was a battlefield of whispers and half-empty glasses. Guests streamed toward the exits, some muttering that they hadn't signed up for a courtroom drama at a wedding. Others stayed, phones raised high, broadcasting every second to a wider world hungry for spectacle. The MC stood near the stage wringing his hands, his voice cracking as he urged people to remain calm, but his words scattered like leaves in the wind. At the head table, the Rivers family huddled together, their perfect posture broken. Hank barked something at Colton in a low, furious voice, while Candace dabbed at her temple with a napkin, as if she might faint. Ava sat rigid in her chair, her mascara streaked across her cheeks, the shimmering image of a bride turned into a collapsed facade. Then she rose suddenly, stumbling across the floor in her gown, nearly tripping on the hem. She grabbed my arm, her fingers clawing into my sleeve. "Dad," she whispered hoarsely, loud enough for nearby tables to hear, "you can fix this. Just take it back. Say you were exaggerating. I'll apologize. I'll smooth it over with everyone. Please don't destroy me." I looked at her. The desperation in her eyes wasn't for reconciliation. It was for preservation. She wanted to salvage reputation, not repair the bond between us. I felt the old ache of fatherhood stir in my chest, but I steadied myself. "No, Ava," I said, voice steady, cutting through the noise around us. "The truth cannot be undone, and it won't be silenced again." The words made her flinch. Around us, guests leaned in, sensing something heavier was about to unfold. Inside, I wrestled with the weight of it. She was still my daughter. The little girl who once clung to me in thunderstorms was now a woman drowning in her own vanity. A part of me wanted to soften, to give her one last chance. But then Laura's voice echoed in my memory, her plea, her dying words asking me not to enable cruelty, not to betray her memory by giving in. The promise I had made to my wife held like iron chains around my conscience. I stepped back toward the microphone, leaving Ava clutching the air. "For those who wonder what comes next," I said, "I want to be transparent. I prepared for this night, though I hoped it would never come. I held up 2 envelopes, identical except for the red ribbon around one. There are 2 wills." The audience gasped. Phones shot upward again, flashes strobing across the room. "This first one," I continued, holding the plain envelope aloft, "was written years ago. It left everything, my home, my accounts, every dollar, to my daughter, Ava Mercer." A faint murmur of relief flickered across her face, and for a second I saw hope reignite in her eyes. I lifted the second envelope, sealed with the red ribbon. "And this," I said clearly, "was drafted more recently. It leaves nothing to Ava. Instead, it directs all $18 million and any further income from my investments to the Texas Oncology Research Foundation, in memory of my late wife, Laura. The funds will build a research wing to fight the disease that took her life." The room went still. The contrast between the 2 futures, the daughter's inheritance and the mother's legacy, hung in the air like a blade. Ava's lips trembled. "You wouldn't," she said, shaking her head violently. "If you do that, you'll be remembered as the man who destroyed his own family. People will say you were vindictive, bitter, cruel." I met her gaze, my voice unshaken. "Or," I replied, "I'll be remembered as a man who kept his word to his wife, a man who chose dignity and truth over lies and appearances." The words struck her harder than any evidence I had shown earlier. She staggered back, her face pale, her breath short. Colton leaned toward her, whispering urgently, but she shoved his hand away. I unfolded the red ribbon envelope and laid it flat on the podium. "Tonight, I choose the second will," I declared. "Tonight, I choose truth over convenience and character over comfort. From this moment on, the new will stands." There was no applause at first, only silence. Then a slow, deliberate clapping began at a table near the back. An older couple, strangers to me, nodding solemnly. A few others joined, hesitant but firm. The sound spread, not raucous, but steady and respectful. Ava stood frozen in the middle of the hall, her wedding gown glowing under the lights, her future slipping like sand through her fingers. Colton muttered something to a lawyer seated nearby, while Hank Rivers exhaled sharply, his chest heaving, as though the weight of his family's downfall had finally settled on him. I left the podium, walking past the stunned guests, feeling their stares like heat on my back. The choice was made. Whatever came next, there would be no turning back. The room fractured the moment I stepped away from the podium. Guests rose from their chairs, some muttering about ruined evenings, others with their phones held high, narrating the spectacle for an invisible audience beyond the walls of Belmead Conservatory. A wave of restless energy swept through the hall, shattering whatever illusion of celebration had remained. I could hear snippets of conversation as I made my way back to table 19. "This is going viral tonight," one man whispered. Another muttered, "Poor girl, humiliated by her own father." And then a sharper voice, "No, poor father, Imagine raising a child who would sell you out like that. The battle lines were being drawn right there among the tables. Ava collapsed into her seat, her dress folding in on itself like wilted fabric. Her face was streaked black where the makeup had run, and her sobs cracked the air louder than the music ever had. She looked up at me once, eyes burning with a mixture of rage and desperation. "You've killed me," she spat. "You've killed me in front of everyone I know." Colton stood beside her, his jaw locked tight. He looked less like a groom and more like a man assessing a failed investment. He leaned toward his attorney, seated 2 places down, and said coldly, "Prepare the annulment papers." First thing tomorrow, then, without another glance at Ava, he walked away from the table, leaving his bride stranded in the ruins of her own reception. The Rivers family fared no better. Hank was immediately swarmed by a cluster of business acquaintances, their voices sharp with suspicion. "Is it true about the convertible note?" one demanded. "What does this mean for Riversound's catalog?" another pressed. Hank's rehearsed charm faltered, his face growing blotchy red as he tried to wave off their questions. Candace, pale and trembling, clutched at her pearls before slumping in her chair, forcing 2 bridesmaids to guide her toward the exit. I sat back at my lonely table and let the chaos swirl around me. For years I had imagined what it would feel like to finally speak the truth. I thought it might feel like justice, like liberation, but in that moment, all I felt was hollow. I had honored Laura's last request. I had exposed the lies. Yet the cost was sitting across the hall, shattered and venomous, my only daughter now lost to me more completely than before. A waiter set a fresh glass of water in front of me, his hands shaking as though afraid I might lash out. I thanked him softly. My voice sounded foreign to my own ears, as though it belonged to someone who had aged 10 years in the space of an evening. Then the master of ceremonies returned to the microphone, his expression pinched and pale. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice tight, "the venue has just received a legal notice. We are required to retain all digital files displayed tonight as potential evidence in pending litigation. We ask that no one tamper with the equipment or attempt to remove any materials." The crowd erupted in fresh murmurs. Some gasped, others laughed nervously. A man near the back exclaimed, "They're turning this into a lawsuit already." The air thickened with the acrid stench of legal battle. I understood instantly. The Rivers weren't finished. If they couldn't bury me with shame, they would try to drown me in courts and paperwork. It was a move I had seen from corporations scrambling for survival, and it didn't surprise me that Hank would lean on it now. Still, the reality of what it meant, months of hearings, attacks in the press, and more strain on my already fractured relationship with Ava, pressed down on me like a weight. I rose quietly and walked out of the hall. The night air hit me cold, the cicadas buzzing in the trees beyond the parking lot, indifferent to the wreckage behind me. My truck was parked under a street lamp, the old Ford waiting faithfully as it always had. I climbed in, turned the key, and let the engine's familiar rumble drown out the echoes of shouts spilling from the conservatory doors. On the drive back to Austin, the highway stretched ahead like a ribbon of judgment. My phone vibrated on the passenger seat, lighting up with news alerts. "Wedding scandal in Nashville," one headline read. Another, "Father's speech exposes bride and family in viral disaster." I switched the device off and let the darkness reclaim the cab. When I finally reached my bungalow, the porch light flickered weakly, the boards groaning under my boots as I stepped inside. I set my phone on the counter and turned on the radio out of habit. The first news story crackled through the speakers. Reports of a high society wedding unraveling in chaos tonight. Viral footage shows the bride's father revealing shocking financial secrets and altering his will in front of hundreds of guests. I turned the dial down. The truth had been spoken, but the storm was only beginning. Ava had lost her marriage, the Rivers had lost their facade, and I, though I had won the battle for truth, felt the heavier loss of blood ties turning to ash. And beyond all that, the shadow of the courtroom loomed. Back in Austin, the bungalow felt smaller than ever. The porch light hummed above me each night as I sat awake, unable to coax myself into sleep. The wedding was over, but its shadow lingered like a storm that refused to clear. On every screen I turned on, television, phone, even the gas station news ticker, There was my face and Ava's, paired with headlines that screamed of scandal. The Wedding Avenger, one network dubbed me, their anchors smiling as though they'd coined a brand. Others called me cruel, unhinged, vindictive. The internet chewed on the story like a bone, spitting out memes and arguments, each one more detached from the truth than the last. I wished Laura were here. I wished she could tell me whether I had gone too far. She had asked me to protect her memory, to draw a line if Ava ever crossed it, but she hadn't told me what to do when that line dragged us all into the public square. Sitting in my living room, I pulled down the old cedar box from the closet, the one where I kept Laura's letters and photographs. The smell of cedar and dust filled the air as I sorted through envelopes yellowed with time. At the bottom was the phone I still kept charged, storing her voice memos. Not the harsh warning I had played at the wedding, but softer ones. Her laughing as she described Ava's high school prom dress, her gentle reminders to pick up milk. I let those words wash over me, grounding me in a tenderness I feared I had lost. But reality pressed hard. The Rivers family had money, influence, and lawyers who played the long game. It was only a matter of time before they filed their countersuits. So I scheduled a meeting with Martin Harris, the attorney who had quietly handled my estate plans for years. We met at his office downtown, walls lined with law books that looked older than me. "They'll argue mental incompetence," Martin said bluntly after I laid everything out. "You altered your will in an emotionally charged setting, in front of hundreds of witnesses. They'll say you were unstable, unfit to make such a decision." I expected as much. "And my medical records?" I asked. "Already helpful," he said, leafing through the folder I had brought. "Physical checkups, psychiatric evaluations, all clear. And that preemptive letter from your therapist confirming sound judgment? That's gold." I nodded, the accountant in me already cataloging the evidence into neat mental rows. Then the phone rang. An unfamiliar number from Tennessee. I almost let it go to voicemail, but instinct told me to answer. On the other end was Robert Ellison, a major investor who had recently pulled out of Riversound. "Mr. Mercer," he said, his tone clipped but respectful. "I saw what happened. I'll be frank, you embarrassed them, but you also told the truth. If this goes to court, I'd be willing to testify. People like me, we've watched Hank cover cracks for years. You just ripped off the veneer." It was the first time since that night I didn't feel completely alone. Someone outside the family saw what I had done and understood why. When I returned home, I made my decision. I sat at my kitchen table with Martin's paperwork spread in front of me, the pen heavy in my hand. I signed the documents that would formalize the second will, transferring all assets to the Texas Oncology Research Foundation. At the same time, I authorized an advance donation of $5 million, ensuring that even if lawsuits dragged on for years, part of Laura's legacy was already secured. The check was couriered that same evening. As I sealed the envelope, I felt something unclench inside me. Not relief exactly, but clarity. Ava might hate me forever. The Rivers might drag my name through courtrooms and headlines, but Laura's wish would stand. Later that night, I sat in the quiet of the living room, the lamp throwing a pale glow over the cedar box still open beside me. I whispered into the emptiness, "This is the path, Laura. No turning back." 6 months later, the echoes of that disastrous night still lingered. What had begun as a wedding reception in Nashville had turned into one of the most talked about scandals in the region. The video clips of me standing at the microphone, holding 2 envelopes and unveiling truths long buried, had been shared millions of times across social media. News anchors coined it the Nashville wedding scandal, replaying footage with dramatic commentary as if it were a courtroom drama instead of a family tragedy. Strangers sent letters praising me as a man of principle. Others condemned me as merciless. None of them saw the nights I spent staring at the ceiling fan in my bungalow, wondering whether silence might have been kinder. For Ava, the aftermath was immediate and brutal. 37 days after the ceremony, Colton filed for annulment. The legal document cited fraudulent misrepresentation of family financial status. Though it sounded clinical, the reality was brutal. Her new marriage ended before it had begun. Soon after, Ava left Tennessee entirely. Word spread that she had taken a modest job at a small marketing agency in Portland, Oregon. She locked her social media accounts, deleted photographs from the wedding, and withdrew from the spotlight she once craved. Reports reached me through friends of friends, stories of a woman who arrived at work quietly, kept to herself, and went home alone. The Rivers family fared no better. Hank, once proud of his reputation as a stalwart of Nashville's music industry, lost his seat on several boards. Investors distanced themselves, citing lack of transparency. His voice, once booming with authority, now carried the brittle edge of a man scrambling to maintain relevance. Candace, shaken by the humiliation of that night, resigned from the charitable foundation she had chaired for years. Whispers circulated that the grand home they lived in was now at risk of foreclosure after Riversound Records bled contracts and lost major clients. The empire they built on appearances was crumbling brick by brick. Meanwhile, I focused on keeping my promise. The transfer of funds to the Texas Oncology Research Foundation was completed without delay. All $18 million were moved into a trust designated to build the Laura Mercer Research Wing. The groundbreaking ceremony took place on a mild spring morning. I stood in the back of the crowd, dressed simply, watching the ribbon being cut. A banner with Laura's name stretched across the scaffolding. For the first time since her death, I felt a measure of peace. Her name was no longer tied to suffering, but to hope for patients still fighting. Letters began arriving at my bungalow. Families of cancer patients wrote to thank me. A few enclosed photographs of loved ones in hospital gowns, holding signs that read, "Thank you, Frank," or "In memory of Laura." These letters meant more to me than the applause or condemnation of strangers online. They reminded me that the money was no longer just numbers in a bank account. It had transformed into something living, something that might buy time for others. And yet, the cost remained. Ava had not called, not once. No messages arrived, no letters. She had severed ties completely. I had honored Laura's words, preserved her dignity, and given her death a legacy. But I had also accepted that my daughter might never walk back through my door. Some nights, I stood on the porch, staring at the quiet street, imagining headlights turning into the driveway, imagining her stepping out to say the words I longed to hear. The driveway stayed empty. So, I lived simply. The same old Ford rested in the driveway. The same creaking floorboards greeted me each morning. I cooked my own meals, read the paper, and walked the same neighborhood routes Laura and I once strolled together. Life became quieter, stripped of illusions. And though my heart still ached, I could meet my own eyes in the mirror without shame. Some victories don't come with celebration, they come with solitude. And solitude, I learned, can carry its own kind of peace. The evenings grew quieter as summer settled over Austin. I spent most nights in my small bungalow, the hum of the ceiling fan carrying through the rooms, the air heavy with the scent of honeysuckle drifting in from the yard. Life had slowed to a pace I could manage. No more reporters calling, no more footage of that wedding flooding every television screen. Just silence. And for the first time in years, I welcomed it. I often sat at the kitchen table around dusk, staring out the window as the last strips of sunlight bent across the horizon. It was in those moments that I let myself reflect, not just on the chaos of that night, but on the long path that had led me there. 8 years of silence, of watching Ava carve her own identity, of honoring Laura's dying wish, and then the eruption that stripped everything bare. It had cost me my daughter. It had cost her a marriage and the illusion of belonging she so desperately chased. The truth carried a heavy price. Yet, beneath the grief, there was something else. A deep, steady peace. I no longer carried the burden of secrets. No more pretending. No more allowing lies to define me. Laura's memory was safe, honored not by wealth, but by integrity. That realization became my anchor when doubts threatened to pull me under. One evening, while sorting through the mail, I came across a plain envelope with the return address of the Texas Oncology Research Foundation. Inside was a handwritten letter from a young medical student. "I never knew your wife," the letter read, "but her name is the reason I'll be able to become a doctor. The scholarship I received from the Laura Mercer Fund has lifted a weight I thought I'd never escape. I promise to carry her name with pride." I sat back in my chair, the letter trembling slightly in my hands. Tears I hadn't expected welled up and blurred the words. For months I had been haunted by the thought that Laura might not have wanted her memory tied to such public humiliation. Yet, here was proof that her name was already building something larger than either of us, something rooted in hope, not scandal. That letter became a turning point. It reminded me that legacy isn't measured in dollars or headlines. It's measured in the lives we touch, in the doors we open for others. Laura used to tell me, wealth is only useful if it builds kindness, not pride. I hadn't understood the full depth of her words until now. I still missed Ava. The silence between us remained, and perhaps always would. But I came to see that love does not always mean giving someone what they want. Sometimes it means standing firm when they would destroy themselves with vanity. The betrayal cut deep, but in its wake I found clarity. I had not failed as a father. I had simply chosen to be a man of principle, even when it cost me her affection. The world remembered the wedding as a scandal. I remembered it as the night I kept my promise. And promises, I had learned, mattered more than appearances. Now, when I poured my morning coffee and stepped onto the porch, I could breathe without the weight of secrecy pressing down. I imagined Laura somewhere beyond the veil, smiling that quiet smile she always wore when she was proud. That was enough for me. The lesson I realized was simple. Sometimes we must lose what we hold most dear to protect who we are. Betrayal may wound us, but it can also strip away illusions and leave only what is true. In the end, character outlives wealth, and integrity outshines reputation. I folded the student's letter carefully and placed it in the wooden box with Laura's photos. Then I sat back, watching the sky fade from gold to violet, content in the knowledge that while I had lost much, I had kept the one thing that mattered most, my soul intact. In the end, every story of betrayal and reckoning leaves us with the same question. What truly endures when the noise fades? Wealth, status, and appearances can dazzle for a season, but they collapse quickly when built on pride or deceit. What remains steady is the quiet strength of truth and the dignity of holding to it, even when the cost feels unbearable. Life has a way of testing our loyalties and exposing our values. Sometimes the trials come from those closest to us, making the pain sharper and the choices harder. Yet it is in those very moments that character is revealed. Choosing honesty over illusion, integrity over convenience is never easy, but it is the only foundation strong enough to carry us through the storms of disappointment and loss. There is a deeper lesson in every wound. Betrayal can cut deeply, but it also creates space for reflection, for growth, for rediscovering what matters most. When we are stripped of false comforts and forced to confront uncomfortable truths, we often discover a strength we didn't know we carried. That strength becomes the compass pointing us back to what is timeless: compassion, integrity, and the courage to stand firm. The greatest legacy is not measured in possessions left behind, but in the lives touched, the kindness given, and the principles upheld when compromise would have been easier. To honor love, to keep faith with promises, and to transform pain into purpose, these are the quiet victories that last long after wealth and reputation are forgotten. Sometimes the path to peace is paved with sacrifice, and sometimes the truest measure of a life well lived is not in what we gain, but in what we refuse to lose: our humanity, our dignity, and the wisdom to let truth speak for itself. These turning points remind us that setting boundaries and valuing ourselves is not just an act of courage, it's the foundation of living with dignity. Now, I'd love to hear from you. What's one lesson from this story that you feel connected to, and how will you apply it in your own life? Let's grow together by sharing our thoughts. If this story resonated with you, drop a 1 in the comments. If not, feel free to leave a 0. Your feedback helps us improve. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that touch the heart and spark reflection. Thank you for watching, and here's to living life with strength, honesty, and authenticity.